we're going to start by talking about ideas, how we can fork a project, customize the project, and then occasionally push some of our customizations upstream. There are a couple of use cases we can think of. One, both my company and Marco's company are interested in is where we have a product that we've built that we customize for different clients. And every so often, a client customization needs to be pushed back into the main repo. But I guess this also would apply if we were using an open source gem, Ruby gem, for example, and we customized it and then wanted to push one of those customizations up to the upstream. It also correlates a little bit with what GitLab do with CE, EE, and JH, but we're going to talk about that a bit later, I think. So, Marco, over to you.
Yeah. So yes, yesterday I asked Lee how we could solve this problem because one of the most experienced person I know of. So yeah, and the main problem that I was trying to solve is that we have a product that is has a standard, a common baseline, and then we can have every customization based on the client on top of it. And sometimes when some customization we find it good enough to be brought back to the standard repository so that every customer can actually benefit of that feature, and that's the problem that we're trying to solve. Because what I first thought was to create a fork of the main repository for every customer, and then if we have to bring back that feature to the main repository to then update every customer, we could do it with cherry picking the commits that actually introduce that feature. So I started making some tests and I discovered some problems because there's some funkiness going on with cherry picking and then rebasing the the standard project back to the project that actually we got the changes from. So the first test that I did, first of all, I created these two projects that are actually public, so we can also share this one. I don't know actually where. But yeah, this is the standard project that I then forked on this customization project. And I tried to make 3 commits, 2 of them that wouldn't go back to the standard project, and 1 of them that introduced a change that should go back to the standard project. I guess
Makes sense so far, Andrew.
Yeah, making sense to me.
Cool.
Okay, maybe we should have a look at the history of the final test, so then we can talk about it and maybe understand it better.
Can I quickly ask, is there a requirement to use forks, or is that just the first approach you thought of?
No, it was not the first approach, but the second approach, because my first approach was actually not using forks, but using simply branches. The forks, I thought about forks because they would give more isolation, I guess, so that everything related to a particular customer is on that fork and doesn't get mixed up with everyone else.
I think that's being able to fork to move it to a different group where you can have, it's a separate project, so it can have its own issues, different permissions potentially. I think its own issue tracker and exist under a different group where various organizations such as ours structure our group hierarchy where each group represents a client.
Okay.
Yeah, that's actually
But if
one.
branching would work a lot better, then we're definitely worth chatting that idea through.
Yeah, and yeah, forks actually is handy for making that custom project under, for example, the customer group on GitLab, so we can have issues on that fork. The only downside of that is that we actually can't really use issues, because if you open an issue on a fork project, you don't have all the functionalities of like if you open that issue on the main repository, because for example, usually on the issue page you have the create merge request button that automatically creates the branch and creates the EMR, but you don't have it on forks, so that's not really the full the complete features of issues, I guess, on forks. But yeah, that's a minor thing, because you can always open the branch manually and the MR also. So that's not really a problem. But yeah, I'm. How can I show you? Maybe here. Yeah. So basically, I started the first two commits that are on this fork are the one that came from the standard branch, let's call it that way. Then I created this commit that changed a file common to both the standard and the fork, and this wouldn't go back to the standard. Then I created another oh yeah, the test really messed up the commits. I don't really know how to explain this well.
You did 3 commits, so didn't you? And I think, was it the middle one you sort of said we wanted to get upstream, but the first and the last one we didn't, sort of thing.
Yeah, maybe it's easier if I take a look at here. Basically, I created the main repository with just the README file. Then I forked it and I changed that README file on the fork. For example, this was the original content. Then I added this change that I don't want to bring back to the standard. Then I added another commit with this change that instead I want to go back to the standard, and another one later on that would not go back to the standard. So basically, I tried to shoot myself in my foot, because then this created some conflicts.
Creating a real world scenario, though, ideally, right? Rather than it just being too
exactly.
simple.
Yeah. So after I created these 3 commits on my fork, I added the remote for the original for the upstream, which is the standard repository. I created a branch starting from the latest commit on the main branch of the standard repository, and then I cherry picked the commit that was introducing this change from the fork to bring it back to the standard project. The cherry picking didn't go so well, because it created a first conflict that I had to resolve in order to actually continue with the cherry picking and then move it back to the standard. So I fixed that conflict, and I created the EMR to actually bring this change back to the standard. Everything went smoothly in there. But then when I actually tried to rebase the standard repository back to the fork, so basically getting the latest changes from that, it generated a conflict because this on the fork, I already had updated this file, and this change was getting pulled for a second time. And so I had this conflict in this file. And
so it's kind of conflict in both directions.
Yes, it was a mess. Anyway, I solved that conflict, and everything's fine. So right now I'm in a position where I have the change back on the standard, and I can rebase every fork so that they can get that change. The only problem is on the fork that originated the change, because obviously that generated the conflict. Maybe even other forks could have the same problem if they also changed that same file in another way. I didn't test that, but I can kind of presume that it would generate a conflict in there.
Yeah, I think it definitely will create a
Yeah.
conflict.
Yeah. Another test that I did.
I was going to say as well, I don't think you want to be rebasing all of your forks, because that's going to mess with the commit history, and then that's going to mess with everyone else's checkouts. So it's going to be a complete pain.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things that's strange.
So you would actually merge the upstream project over the top maybe instead, or?
Yeah, that's why I was wondering if forks are a necessity, because if you could keep it in the same repository, then merging is a bit easier. I mean, you can still merge across forks. It's just, yeah, you've got to make sure you add both of the forks, or at least you have to make sure you add the upstream to all of your clones of each fork that you have, and the upstream needs to have every single fork as a separate origin as well, separate remote configured.
So you can't actually get the changes from the upstream on the fork. You have to push them from the upstream to the fork. So
yeah.
No, I think you can. I'm just trying to figure it out in my head. So definitely when you've checked out or cloned, I guess is more the correct terminology. You cloned the fork. You say you would have to add the remote, the upstream remote, and that would allow you to merge the upstream remote into the on top of the fork, or whatever the correct terminology is. That's right. But the other way around, what would you do? You would just create a new branch. Oh yeah, so you're right, Andrew. So as and when you then say, right, okay, client A customization, we want to cherry pick something from there, you would need to open your clone of the standard project, the upstream project, add the remote of client A's fork, and then cherry pick from there to then create your new branch and merge request.
Yeah, you can do all of that on the remote as well. I'm on the fork as well, I guess. I mean, I guess, yeah, it actually doesn't make a difference where you create that, does it? Because you would have to create, you'd have to create a new branch on either project.
Yeah.
Cherry pick the commits into that branch, and then open up a merge request with the upstream.
Yes.
And then resolve any conflicts.
Yeah.
And then each fork would have to merge in the upstream's main branch with their main branch.
But it's interesting because I think the that path that you've suggested, the benefit of merging rather than rebasing is that commit chars won't be changed, so you'll get a slightly better. It'll understand a bit better how to merge some of the stuff. Is that right?
Yeah, I think if you do a rebase as well, anyone who has cloned a fork and then you perform a rebase on that, their local clones will be like out of sync, and you'll end up, when they try and do a pull, it will throw a wobbly and say, all of the commits are different.
Thinking, aside from that, I think it might help as well. Would it or wouldn't it? Maybe it wouldn't. I mean, the main thing is the underlying way that Git works, and I definitely don't understand it well enough to kind of comment on the fact that it doesn't understand, because the commit char is completely different when you do the cherry pick. It just doesn't understand that commit that you've cherry picked into the upstream, that commit has already been applied to the fork.
Well, actually, let me check.
Otherwise, it would conflict, right? It would just sort of say, although you did say something about it skipping, didn't you?
Yeah, exactly. Because the other test that I did was adding a new file from on a fork, bringing it back to the upstream, and then rebasing the upstream on top of the fork. And in that case, the rebase actually said that skip previously applied commit, which was the one that actually introduced the file.
Is that because you didn't have any other? I think that's because you didn't have any other commits. The char would be the same. Do you think your scenario was a bit too simple? Do you think you needed to add a few other commits around the one that you cherry picked? I think that's why it's, because yesterday, Andrew, we did a bit of Googling and got our minds blown at how Git calculates the char based on the tree and the time and your hair color and whatnot. So, we were sort of trying to understand if it would be possible to retain, like keep the same char when you cherry pick, when you sort of merge, apply the same commit to different forks or branches or repositories or whatever you want to call it. But the answer seemed to be a resounding no. So, but in this scenario, I think because at the time you applied the commit to the fork, the fork and the upstream commit chars were identical. I think they were the same. I mean, you introduced a new file and then you cherry picked that single commit. So the chars probably would have remained the same. But I think if you had have made a change on your upstream in the meantime, and then cherry picked your commit from your upstream into, cherry picked your commit from your fork into upstream, I think then the char would have been different and it wouldn't have skipped it.
Yeah.
I think it's all down to the way that Git handles like merges, if that's the right word. And as I say, I'm really kind of a beginner when it comes to Git, but I don't think it were my understanding a long time ago, or expectation or hope or whatever, I think, was that it just looks at the file and says, oh, right, okay, well, you've got this bit at the top, you've got this bit at the bottom, you haven't got this bit in the middle. So that's the diff, and that's what you need to do to kind of make this version match this version. Or in the scenario where you do already have it, where you're rebasing your fork off of upstream, it says, well, you have already got this change, this bit in the middle, so we don't need to do anything. But I'm 99% sure that isn't how it works.
Correct. Git doesn't store diffs, it calculates diffs based on the tree.
Yeah, but The other downside of this approach that I was thinking about before is that you have to be very careful when you actually introduce the new features, because you have to split them on the commits. You have to be careful not to mix how can I say it, things specific for the customer with the things that could maybe one day become standard, because then it would be a nightmare to actually pick the commits, because you
Yeah.
couldn't actually pick a commit. You should pick changes inside of that commit.
Yeah. And having the forethought and hindsight to separate the commits in that way is I'm going to say near impossible.
Yeah. So
So, Andrew, do you remember before GitLab sort of combined the code base into? Apparently, we're getting some feedback somehow.
No, it's just, I can hear your notifications, and I thought it was my notifications going on.
I don't know how that would work because I've got headphones on, so surely the microphone can't hear that.
I guess it's mine.
Maybe.
So, where's my brain going? Yeah, so sorry, Andrew, were you aware, or do you know how before GitLab became a single code base, how they used to do this with in C? Did they already have the folder separation, so you didn't really get conflicts?
I did do some commits around them, but I wasn't actually active with the EE stuff, so I'm not sure. I know they moved to the single repository with the EE folders because they were having a very hard time with having the two separate repos.
Yeah.
And now the FOSS repo is just a mirror of the main repo with all the EE folders removed.
Gotcha.
But yeah, I'm not sure exactly how that went.
Failing like the GitLab implementation, which we'll definitely talk about at a later stage and consider sort of how we can do something similar-ish where we kind of extend classes or override classes, etc. Do you have any other bright ideas, Andrew, as to alternate approaches to this kind of problem?
So except all of these ideas that we've had. Unfortunately, I don't.
So you thinking it's sort of the underlying way that we're trying to use Git to do something that it just isn't capable of doing. So it's finding a better way to do it almost in code, if that's the right term.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think Git's doing what it's doing as best as it can. I think not the problem. Yeah, it's the way it's being encapsulated. It's not the right word. Segregated, I guess. And I can't think of a nicer way of doing that.
So,
Yeah, my first thought when Marco was explaining this was if you had the single repository, you have your main branch, which has the main code in, obviously. You have your individual branches for each customer, I guess. And then every so often you would merge main branch into the customer branches. And when you need to merge back from a customer branch into the main branch, you would start a new branch, cherry pick those commits, merge it into main, and then merge main back into the customer branch. You can absolutely do that with the forks as well. Like instead of having individual branches for customers, you just fork it out and do the same kind of workflow. You're never going to get around.
Yeah.
You'll never get away from the fact that because you're trying to cherry pick a small portion of a change from a file without including the surrounding changes, you will get conflicts. The only way to minimize that is to like preemptively know what it is you're going to want to merge back into the main branch. Which
in which
isn't
case you
always
just
possible.
apply it to the main branch straight
Exactly.
away.
Yeah.
Even
then you'll potentially get conflicts though, because when you merge the main back into the customer branch, if the customer branch still had changes in that README, Git doesn't know where that new paragraph goes. Should it go above the new paragraph on the customer branch or below that paragraph kind of thing?
Yeah,
it
it's
just knows.
slightly better at handling that sort of thing, though, right? And they're the sort of standard conflicts that you would always get when rebasing, anyway.
Yeah.
I guess that ultimately maybe the best way to actually do these kind of things is that when you decide that some feature can go back to the standard, to the upstream, you manually get the changes, bring them back, test them on the standard, and then update the other forks.
I think you're right. I think it's actually more work trying to do this by just kind of cherry picking and raising MRs and doing this than it would be to actually look at the code and take the bits that you need, raise the MR into the upstream, and then vice versa. Assuming that these aren't huge kind of pieces of code, if that makes sense. And again, I guess if you're using some nice, what would you call them, programming paradigms or principles or whatever, that you've got a certain level of isolation and single responsibility and those kind of things. So I guess docs is definitely somewhere where that can explode a bit depending on how they're separated. But if you've added a whole new kind of, let's say it's a new table for a new kind of model and some underlying bits and pieces, it's likely that you'll be able to pull those files across, and then there would be like one or two places where those files then need referencing. And Mark, I know that you work on .NET World, and then you get conflicts in your CS proj files, and
that's not fun.
The problem with doing it manually like that would be if you want to retain any relationship about where those changes have come from. If you want to see like why a particular file was added kind of thing, you won't have that relationship if you're manually going through and just like copying those files over.
So your MR or your commit or whatever would have to reference previous MRs or commits, and
which is then just you're just changing one kind of busy work for another kind of busy work.
Absolutely. So it's kind of like the answer is plugins, microservices, kind of weird alternative way of extending and modifying code without actually modifying and extending code.
I'm not sure. Is there like a concrete example of what it is you're trying to do that you can share, or is it confidential? It's fine if it's confidential. I'm just curious because it's kind of tricky to.
I think GitLab would be fine to use an example, wouldn't it? Just sort of saying, like, you imagine that the GitLab E and CE projects on, I suppose it's that folder separation that makes life a little bit easier. But I think that's a perfect example. I know they brought something, I think time tracking was maybe brought from EE into CE. So, it was created in EE in the fork. Or I don't know if it's a fork or just a completely separate repository. And then some point down the line, they decided, actually, this is going to be in CE.
Because you could... you could definitely go like the GitLab way, where you just have a single project and you put the customizations for each customer in a separate folder. I'm not sure if you're building like an executable or a package or something, because then you would just set up your CI to. Oh,
Yeah.
my
My example is actually on our web app, in which we have all the backend and the front end separate, and yeah, I think a folder for each customer won't be.
So let me just push that a little bit further. So I have very little knowledge, so you might have to do some more research, and we can definitely pull some other people in. But I think that the JH GitLab project goes a step further than the EE. So rather than putting all the JH in the main GitLab repository and project, they do actually have their own project. And I don't know the specifics about the implementation, but there are a few things that have to occasionally go into the main repository to kind of facilitate the JH. I'm going to call it a fork. I don't know if it is a fork, but there's sort of an architecture that you can build that will allow you to extend without having to push all of those things into the main repo. I don't know. I want to say that Ruby, well, the way that the EE stuff works is kind of a bit like partial classes in C#. I don't know, Andrew, the languages that you're working with primarily, and if you've got something similar where you can have two of the same class and they kind of get smushed together.
Yeah, but that becomes more dependent on the language or framework more than on the
Absolutely
platform.
Yeah.
Because in our use case, we have, for example, .NET for the backend, but we have JavaScript and TypeScript for the front end. So
yeah,
that wouldn't actually work.
I'm trying to think how we do that with the GitLab project, sort of smushing the E and CE stuff together. I think again, there's like an abstraction layer somewhere there that's kind of responsible for loading both if available and just the one if not.
Yeah.
So the end result of this is that we're similar conversation to yesterday. Marco's prepared an explanation of this, and I guess we can link to this video now as well, and potentially post on the forum to just kind of see if anyone else has got any bright ideas and come across the same problem, and kind of go from there, I guess. Apologies that we weren't of more help, Marco, but we helped you to validate the problem is a problem.
I guess 3 people with three different ideas,
approaches and mindsets.
Yeah, but we all come to the same conclusion. So
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So I don't know whether to end stream. So there's a separate record. So we separate this recording, and then we'll share back again, and we'll see if we can pick some issues to look at.
I guess we can do that if we want to separate the 2 streams.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay.
We'll be back in a few seconds then.